Welcome. We have a very, very illustrious panel today of movers and shakers in the world of music documentary. To my left, Peter Worsley, who is Managing Director of Eagle Rock Films, one of the largest producers and distributors of music documentaries around the world, including many of our films, which thank you. Their Joe Cocker film, American Valhalla, is showcasing at Sheffield on Sunday and Tuesday.
They're two different
films, Joe Cocker and American Valhalla, on Sunday and Tuesday. Francis Whately, sitting next to Peter, producer director at BBC Studios. He was responsible for two recent David Bowie films, and has just made a film about called Guns for Hire, about sidemen, the sidemen and women who stand in the back of the band, the people that you may not know about. Then over here we have, from America, Amir Bar-Lev, whose beautiful film about the Grateful Dead, A Long Strange Trip, kept me up half the night because it's 4 hours, but I was saying to him earlier I just needed a spliff or something because, you know, I thought I better not have a glass of wine or I won't get through it. And I tell you, it's not the same on Diet Coke, I can tell you. So Amir is here from America. Thank you very much for coming to the panel. Then, unfortunately, Julia Nottingham from Pulse Films couldn't be here. She has food poisoning and had actually had a baby about 4 weeks ago, so I was not surprised in a way that she wouldn't be quite up for it. But anyway, fortunately, Beadie Finzi over here has stepped into the breach. Beadie, who actually worked on The Possibilities Are Endless with Pulse, the director of Britdoc, and so her recent collaborations include The Possibilities Are Endless about Edwyn Collins, and also she has her upcoming All These Sleepless Nights. And Britdoc, as you know, is a non-profit organisation that helps independent filmmakers raise money. And then here, next to me is the wonderful Daisy Asquith, who's on the panel because she turned up. So, and also her beautiful film Queer Armour that you probably saw last night, which is extraordinary, which had the most incredible soundtrack from John Grant. And also she has a John Grant documentary, which some awful commissioner at the BBC hasn't made up her mind about yet. Has she? No. So anyway, so she's here. So she's sucking up. Anyway, so music films obviously are, music documentaries seem to be in a special place right now, and maybe they always have been. But, you know, with, 20 Feet from Stardom and Amy and the Oscars and, more and more we see that music films are out there. Obviously rock docs are always the mainstay of BBC Two and BBC Four, but it's just way more than that now because Channel 4 is there in the mix. Then you have all the other platforms, Netflix, Amazon, YouTube, not to mention cinema, of course, let's not leave that out. And then the other thing, of course, as Amir reminded me, is that we did the Manchester concert on last Sunday, went to 56 countries and 23 million people. And, of course, the other thing that changes our agenda, of course, is the role of music to bring people together in these troubled times. The other thing we have is, of course, the audience chooses when they want to watch things, like me at 4 a.m. watching Amir's film last night. And I was thinking how interesting it is that we don't necessarily watch things just because they're there. We watch them when we want to watch them. So all that careful shaping that we do is affected by the fact that the audience will watch the first half an hour and then go out for dinner and come back and then watch the next half an hour. Or they binge watch it like House of Cards. And then the other nightmare, of course, is the rights. So the BBC's blanket agreement has changed. The whole rights position in North America has changed as well. So we can touch on that. I'm going to quiz you later, because I'm hoping there's somebody in the room who's expert on North American music rights. Well, that'll be Peter, probably. Anyway, today we're going to look at how it all works from the horse's mouth, and we hope to bring some clarity for you. So we're going to talk for a bit and hear from everyone on the panel, and then we're going to have about 15 minutes of questions. So what could be simpler? Anyway, we're going to, just to get us in the mood, we're going to run a little clip. So if we could run VT1, that'd be great. Thanks. So I'm going to start with Beadie. So with your project and Pulse's project, the Edwyn Collins collaboration, what steps did you have to take to get that film into production?
I think as a
documentary funder, there is nothing more exciting than the promise of a profound creative collaboration. And there you had two young filmmakers, James Hall and Ed Lovelace, with impossibly kind of Hoxton high hair, you know, who arrived in the office one day and it told us, in the first instance, told us a love story about how they'd met Edwyn Collins and over a very long, quiet period developed a beautiful friendship, began just with recording audio, and over time developed this idea for a feature doc, the majority of which was going to be entirely recreated from Edwyn's imaginings, some of which was going to be documentary. And, you know, it was a pretty preposterous tall order on one level. It was like, what have you, you know, so there's nothing really to show. There was a relationship, and a relationship to music, and an idea. And it was unbelievably exciting and unbelievably compelling. So we love those kinds of films where the music and working with, in this instance, a musician too, is going to be integral to the kind of creative form and the creative expression. So that's what got us going.
But it is a biopic, so in a sense it's a biopic,
and we
but
don't
a very
do
different kind of biopic.
And we don't do, I mean, I was about to say the things that we don't fund. We don't fund concert docs. We don't fund biopics. But this transcended all of those usual definitions or expectations as a piece of independent creative filmmaking.
And when you went out to raise the money, did it read as a music film or a pure documentary? How did it read?
I don't think it read as a pure documentary. I mean, I think, well, documentary is such a wonderful, beautiful, wide word, isn't it? I mean, you know, this was it's a fantastic example of hybrid filmmaking at its most creative and playful and loving and visual. So, yeah, and it was a funny-shaped one. But I tell you the thing that I think made a difference, and I would urge other filmmakers to think about. Yes, this was a film about Edwyn Collins. It was a film about love. It was a film about a relationship. And it was a film about recovering from a devastating stroke. It was about something profound. It was about the greatest struggle maybe that woman can face in their lives. Death, coming back from death. You know, what will my relationship, what's my role in the world? What's my relationship with my wife, my family going to be? I mean, that was a massive and epic story. So, yeah, I would argue it had all the ingredients for a fantastic, rich, complex feature doc. The question was, with the audacious visual concept behind it, could they pull it off? Who knew?
Did they pull it off? I think they did.
I think they did.
But the music was very important to the film, the soundtrack, as indeed with Daisy's Queer Armour last night. John Grant's soundtrack added a particular dimension to the film, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the music held the emotional narrative. The lyrics held the emotional narrative, so that it didn't just become a history of the queer century, but in fact, you know, it became kind of anyone's personal life story. And I hope that you know, John's lyrics allowed it to resonate in that way for people.
Yeah, so certainly it did, and I thought the soundtrack was extraordinary. I don't know, did you see the film last night? I mean, it was an extraordinary experience to hear how the music and the story was totally interwoven and added a whole other dimension, I thought, to the film. I thought it was extraordinary. So now I'd like to turn to Francis. Francis, we're just going to have a look at a small clip of Sidemen, a new film which is on BBC4 in 4 weeks. So obviously in these films, you know, access to the artists themselves is really, really important, and you know, to tell their stories and to sort of let us know what went on from the engine room. So Francis, tell us, how did this film come about?
This film was a follow-up after the first David Bowie film I made 5 years. Earl Slick was in that film, and Earl Slick was Bowie's sideman, and he was doing Meltdown with Yoko Ono, and he had a little session where he did a thing called The Diary of a Sideman. And he invited me to that at Meltdown, and I thought it was fascinating, and I thought, is there something we can do here about those people, in a similar way to the 20 Feet from Stardom film, actually, but is there any way we can do something where the musicians are celebrated, the musicians, the backing singers, etc., who are not necessarily known? How can we do something with those guys? So Earl Slick is such a sort of extraordinary 100% character that I took him to breakfast with Jan and the commissioner of BBC4, and he sort of won them over. So in that way, that bit was quite easy. But then I had to find the other characters, and getting access to the Wendy and Lisas, to the Steve Croppers, to the Crystal Talafieras took a long time, and it's been, I think, 3 years now since that meltdown, and it goes out in about a month, that film. But it's taken a long time to get the sort of people like Wendy and Lisa on board. I think we were very lucky with Wendy and Lisa in that Wendy, when she filmed that, she was about to get divorced the next day, so she was particularly vulnerable. Mm. And she was also about to go on tour with the Revolution, and she also hadn't done a proper interview about her relationship with Prince since he died. Wow. So the timing all was perfect for us. And she just was incredibly nice and incredibly giving. And I think she was a huge Bowie fan. She had a picture of David Bowie on her wall just next to where that interview was that I'd never seen, and I thought I'd seen everything. But she is a huge fan, so that really helped, having made that film before. So you do a little piggyback off the back of what you've done before. And I think that film, for me, is about, ostensibly it's about sidemen and those people in the shadows, but I think more it's a film about us all and about how we all feel, and they're, as freelancers, really. I mean, those sidemen are rather glamorous freelancers, but they're freelancers all the same. And the feelings they have of wanting validation, wanting to be thanked, are the same that we all feel. So I think it's a much more human story than it might appear. It's not just a music doc, I hope.
Thank you. And Amir, your beautiful film, Long Strange Trip, I mean, that's also was a matter of access, wasn't it? And I noticed you had Martin Scorsese as one of your exec producers, and I wondered if that helped you open doors, or how you opened the door to telling that story.
Well, no, I can answer that in one word. It didn't really help me. Well, that film took 11 years to happen, and it's because the Grateful Dead are an extraordinarily fucked up group of people, very disorganized, and I must have pitched them over the course of all those years, like several different versions of the film. I couldn't get them to do anything. Finally, I just started accruing people around them. So there's like 400 producers, and that's how it works sometimes in rock and roll. Is there's the whole sort of like backstage pass comfort level thing that you're dealing with. So finally, it was just like, Martin Scorsese, how about that? And I mean, I'll just say, why not? I've never even really spoken to the guy. I don't really say that, but I'm kind of at the end of my publicity run with it, so fuck it. I'm just gonna say.
But having the name, on the film.
I wanted to, but he's very busy. Yeah. So I don't, he was kind of a godfather to the thing, and he made the band and the band's managers and the band's managers' lawyers and everybody feel comfortable. And ostensibly he was going to stand in if I fucked something up, but I didn't. So he kept a huge amount of distance. So, yeah.
But we did, I don't want to go one up on you, but we did a film with him about George Harrison, and I actually met him. He came to London for the screening, which was full red carpet with everybody you can imagine there. And there he was in the corner. And I thought, this is my moment to meet Marty Scorsese. So I went over and I said, thank you so much for the beautiful film. And he was like cowering the corner in front of the glitterati of the British music industry. And he said, did I fuck up your icon? Which I thought was very, very sweet, actually.
Yeah.
So I think he felt the full responsibility of his film, standing in the room with sort of, Paul McCartney on one side and Mick Jagger on the other. Anyway, we're going to see a clip of Amir's film in a moment, but I want to turn just to the funding process and talk to Peter. So, Peter, we've had the idea and we've written our treatment, and then we come along to you, and I just wondered if you could talk us through the sort of possibilities, because now you know, distributors are not just distributors, they're funders. They're producers and funders. And I just wondered if you could talk us through a little bit about how you set about, you know, when a producer comes to you or a director comes to you with an idea, how you set about that. But first, before you answer that question, think about that question, I'm going to pay you VT3. So, yes, how do you put the money together? How do you...
So this is a very interesting one because it touches a lot of the kind of tensions and changes that I think are going on in the music music industry generally at the moment. Eagle, we're in a quite unusual position because we're the kind of film and TV studio for Universal Music. In this case, we were approached by there was a very successful tour last year that Iggy did with Josh Homme and Matt Helders and of his album Post-Pop Depression. And we were initially approached just to do a concert film of Iggy's show at the Albert Hall with the band last July. And they approached us, I think it was 7 days before the show was going to happen. And we decided to do it based on essentially the kind of traditional model for the music industry, which is relying on DVD and finished goods and vinyl and live audio packaging that we could put around the concert film, but primarily non-TV, non-digital revenue. But actually what pushed us over the kind of brink in terms of of making the decision on the film was when they told me that they'd actually been filming throughout the process of making the album, and that there was this very, very strong story of another love affair, if you like, between Iggy and Josh Homme, Josh from Queens of the Stone Age and Iggy Pop, and that their collaboration was really the story of this film. And that's what made my ears prick up, because I'm always looking for stories coming out of music, whereas if you like, traditionally a company like ours would have been more focused on the music, whether it's the live performance or a very musicological documentary where you chronologically go through and tell the story of an artist's career, and you know, every 5 years he changes label, and then the bass guitarist leaves, and then he gets a new lead guitarist, and the sound changes. And those documentaries, which are principally made for fans and work very well maybe on BBC4 on a Friday night and have their place, but are very different to these more story-driven films. So in the case of American Valhalla, we actually took the plunge and financed both projects, the live performance at the Albert Hall and the documentary, and actually worked to put the whole documentary project together with Josh Homme directing it and co-directing it with another first-time director called Dre Newman. We brought in a producer and a writer, and then relied on funding partially of the concept film through the DVD and the CD, and of the film will be out through Event Cinema, part funding from Amazon, deals in Japan, hopefully in the UK, it'll be a mixture of television, Event Cinema, but also the other funding model that we will use for this is Pledge Music, which is crowdfunding, where we will put together exclusive versions of the film, but also photographs, some of which you saw in the trailer, photographs taken by Matt Helders and Dre Newman, the co-director, which we'll sell to fans, and also exclusive merchandising and packaging. And that will be a final way, quite new way, for us to help cover the advance and the money we put into the production.
So when Beadie, Amir and Daisy come to you with their new films, how do you decide where you're going to place them? Because obviously everyone has ambitions to be in the cinema, and these days you can kind of be everywhere, can't you? Because the cinema window is now changed. You can have, in your case, you had it one night, didn't you? And then you had a week, and now you're on Amazon. and you skip TV altogether, sadly for me. Maybe next time. But how would you approach that?
I think cinema, I don't know other people's experience, but event cinema is a really tricky one for documentaries, because at the same time it's become too easy, and yet it's also become more difficult. So thanks to the growth of the event cinema business, it is now more feasible to put films and art house documentaries into cinemas than it was in the past. On the other hand, you're competing with NT Live or the Metropolitan Opera or these great big juggernauts of the event cinema business, and these sorts of opportunities play very differently and often don't have a great experience in the cinema unless you can really find your fan base, which is, I think, pretty difficult to do.
Can I add something to that? Yeah. I'm just in the middle of dealing with that tension between making something that has a story, as we've been talking about, and making an event.
Yeah.
And I'm only now understanding that we made something that sort of like wobbles between two categories and not necessarily without its tension. Because the thing that interested me about this was always the story aspect. Yeah. And, you know, as you said, that's making something that was bigger than the sum of its parts, not something that sort of marched through the chronology of the band, you know, that the fans would appreciate. So, but we didn't quite understand that if we made it into an event, as we did, and put it in 50 theaters all at once, there'd be a certain set of expectations that it was going to be like a concert, you know, that it was going to be fun. And the film, I mean, I don't think a good film can only be fun, you know, if it has to have conflict. And, you know, and in this case, the main guy dies, you know. So it was a lot of like, I was following Twitter and I was seeing a lot of excited chatter, and then it like dropped off that night because people were, wow, that was heavy, you know. And there's been a lot of basically backlash from the fans that, you know, oh, it's too dark, and that's not what we were expecting, and I mean, this is also particular to Grateful Dead fans, possibly, but I'm not sure it only is. I mean, and they're also this whole issue of chronology, of going through of completism. With regards to fans is really, I'm in the heart of it right now, because it's, I don't think you can make a good film that's encyclopedic. It's not, that's a Wikipedia entry. And yet, you know, you'll have fans saying, well, where the heck is their third album in all this? You know, it's like, what are you talking about, you know?
We deal with this all the time, because,
yeah.
I mean, our core business is still making films or releasing concerts of classic rock or heritage acts. And you have a number of problems. One of them, which sounds very stupid, and you probably had as well, but is a lot of these guys are getting on, and they maybe had a life of sex and drugs and rock and roll back in the 60s and 70s, but now they're on their third wife, and they've got kids who are 10, right. 12, 15, teenagers. And they don't want those stories to be told. And they don't really want the tension and the, you know, the misbehaviour from the past and all the stuff which makes good story. They would rather we just talked about the fact that on the new album, you know,
yeah.
the sound changed and they did something else.
Yeah.
And often in these cases, the music, you know, the management are very protective of their artists, and the management can control what music can go into your film. They can block you having any music, you know, if the film's not been approved by the management. And so you have a very difficult creative kind of balance to get right between having the support of the artist and making a film that they want, and having been able to tell a story which interests somebody beyond the fan base, who's obviously going to turn up in the cinema and find out what happened in the third album.
Yeah.
But what we're interested in doing, what I'm certainly interested in doing, is pulling in the audience out there,
right.
who don't know about the Grateful Dead or don't know about some of these heritage bands, but within which there is a great story to be told.
Yeah.
And the relationship with the artist then is paramount to get that trust, so that you can then get the access you need for the film.
Well, the artist will always defer to their management. I mean, almost always. I tried very hard to create that kind of trust, and as Peter said, at the end of the day, the management came along and said, "Great film. Don't like the scene where the 9-year-old kid does a bunch of nitrous oxide, you know, just take that out and we'll be fine." And I said, I don't really want to take that out. I love that scene, you know. And this is what happened, you know. I mean, and that suddenly the question of the rights and all that stuff were in play, even though we had creative control. But when you're making a music film, you may have creative control, but in a way you don't, because you always need stuff from the artists and from the label and the publishing until the very end of the process. So they have a de facto veto power.
Daisy, how about John Grant? Oh.
I'm going to have to let you know something. John Grant's manager is sitting right in front of me.
Oh my God.
And we're eyeing each other.
Oh, good.
Maybe Fiona could
turn the
answer.
camera
Fiona,
off. I'll do it all day.
tell us.
We get on extremely well. John and I are very close because it's taken me 2 years of filming, and luckily we get on extremely well. We're both belligerent and difficult and stubborn. So we're sort of having we're having like a loving tussle at the moment. But Fiona's been fantastically supportive, and yeah, there's things she wants me to cut.
Fiona gets a gold
and I'm
star
not taking
today.
them out.
We should have had a manager on the panel. Well, I mean, the thing is, television is awful, isn't it? Because television has things like fair dealing and stuff, and we go, I want to tell this story. And obviously there's a difference between Nick Broomfield's Whitney Houston film and Kevin MacDonald's Whitney Houston film. One is made with the artist with access and one isn't. But does that mean that, if the story is to be told, that it can only be told with access? I mean, that's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there we come back to the filmmaker and the vision for the story that's to be told, yeah.
It's become a prisoner of your access.
Yeah,
you are a prisoner of your access.
I think also you're often working in a world, the music world, where it's not the same as the film world. I mean, it's so radically different, and what the artist is expecting is so different, and something that you can maybe talk to from a Pulse perspective. The artist is on a completely different calendar in the music world. They're probably, even if they're a heritage artist, they're thinking about how do we use a film to support our new album, or what's the calendar to fit into my release schedule. And that's not really what's working for us and for the TV, or certainly the TV and the theatrical business. And they're not so used to hearing questions about editorial control and storytelling. It's just not in this. They don't have that same sort of language.
And when you're dealing with older artists, they all have a chip on their shoulder about their most recent work. And if you want to focus on their work in the 70s, they look at that and say, well, hang on, I have an album right now. Why don't you talk about that? Why don't you film me recording that album? And it's but that's not your
I think that's a real
greatest
problem.
Album,
that is such a very
Sorry.
Oh wow! Oh wow!
Yeah.
But that is a real problem, though, across all of it, isn't it? That our audience is very nostalgic,
right.
And but if you say to Paul McCartney, "I want to make another film about the Beatles," I mean, they I'm sure he would say he's sick of talking about the Beatles, because actually he has his own life and in his own career, and he's very much an active working artist.
Right.
And I don't think any of them thought that at this time in their life, Mick Jagger and they'd be still strutting around a stage in their early 70s. It just doesn't seem possible. In fact, we had a clip at the BBC where Mick Jagger was interviewed age 30. They said, what are you going to do? He said, I'm going to retire when I'm 35 unless I'm dead, he says in this clip. Anyway, I'd like to talk a bit more about Sign Off, but first I'd like to show the next clip, which is VT4. So question for Beadie. So obviously that's an incredibly sensitive and important film involving an artist and his family. And I can imagine if that was me, I'd want to have some say in how I was betrayed. So Beadie, I just want to ask you the question, what happened in that case in terms of editorial sign-off for that film? How did you deal with that? So delicate.
I mean, I'm speaking, I'm not one of the filmmakers, but
yeah,
but speaking on their behalf, yeah. I mean, they were fantastically close to Edwyn and his wife and his son throughout the whole making of this. So, and the film was not, it wasn't controversial in a way. It was such the rendering, the telling, the retelling, the recapturing of what it felt like, of what the experience was. A near-death experience and then a kind of rehabilitation into the world. there wasn't much to fight about. And the boys told it with such love, and intensity. And almost I say the challenge was not about a conflictual one between them and artists, but almost the way they drove themselves to try and capture that, you know, to capture something which is in someone's mind and their heart, you know. So yeah, the creative drive and intensity, that was what the wrestle was. They're perfectionists. Grace and Edwyn, you know, I think they were a dream, you know. They had plenty to say, of course, you can hear, you know, chippy buggers, the pair of them. But they were also completely... I remember sitting with them the first time they watched the finished film, and we watched it privately. And it was just unbelievably emotional. Actually, that's what it was. It was just unbelievable, you know, because this unbelievably private and intense experience had been captured and made manifest. And so that was a very beautiful private moment between filmmaker and artist.
Wow.
Which, yeah, it gives me goosebumps thinking about it.
Amazing.
But can I just go back to money for a minute? I work for a community of filmmakers who mainly don't have access to the kind of the models that you're talking about. You know, they're piecing together pieces of cash over 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years to make these films, which are often labours of love. They really don't make any economic sense, and they're not going to make any economic sense. You know, if they wash their faces, that's beautiful, that's success. But I would say there's a trick here, which is this is a fantastic hybrid music documentary film, but one of the keys is because at its heart is a story about stroke recovery. There's a whole bunch of other funders who are interested in supporting that work. Because it's not only a kind of creative documentary film, which means you can go to Sundance, to Tribeca, you could have a word with Cine Reach, you can come to people like us, but because it's issue-based also, I mean, it's quite narrow, this particular example, you know, stroke and kind of recovery, but actually there are potentially other kinds of partners and funders who will collaborate with you along the way and help make up the shortfall so you can get to the possibility of cinema, you can get to the possibility of online or TV, whatever the destiny of the movie is. So I just, you know, and we've had this experience lots of times with other kinds of film where, yes, it's a music film, but the music is connecting us to, across a cultural divide, connecting us, giving us access to an experience, and it means there are lots of other kinds of partners who want to come on board and support these projects. So there's hope.
There's hope. That's good. Francis, I wanted to ask you about working with David Bowie, because obviously your first film, he was very much with us, and then the second film, unfortunately, he wasn't. And I just wondered how you dealt with that, with him, the sign-off. I think you have a funny story about that.
Well, the BBC is such a different model in a way to everything everyone else on this panel experiences because, you know, you have funding, you're given money by the channel. If you need more money, you're given it by Worldwide or whatever co-producers you go with, whether it's Eagle Rock or something, but you've got something to start with. It's probably not as much in the end as the independent guys, but it's enough to do it. So you've got that model from the beginning, and also... you know, the BBC does still carry an enormous amount of weight. So if I'd known David Bowie for a very long time, so when I suggested it, although he was already by that time not making or refusing to be interviewed in any way, the BBC still carried a fair amount of clout, and because, as I say, I knew him, so it made it quite easy in some ways. And when he, at the end of the first film, a week before the end, he said, you know, can I see a rough cut? And I just wrote back, of course not. You know, this is the BBC, you know how it works. We don't show rough cuts, you know. And he accepted that completely. You know, which is such a different experience to you, Amir. You know, it's... And even on this film, to the Sidemen film, you know, the clip you saw of Wendy and Lisa, for the UK, that's you know, it's absolutely fine. Now, whether the Prince management behind it all will look at that and say, oh, there's something wrong there, I don't know. But certainly for the UK, that's absolutely fine because we've got the blanket agreement, we've got the music rights, and that makes a huge difference to us.
It's like another world.
It's like another world.
It's like another world. It's like a magical world.
It's like a magical world in some ways, but in other ways, you're also making for a broadcaster that has a broadcast audience. You haven't got an arty audience. You've got an audience that are watching on television. They have very different expectations. They're not a captive audience.
Coming out of EastEnders into your film.
Yeah, or if on BBC4 they are I don't know, a 50 plus audience, a mojo reading audience who have expectations of your film. And they don't want certain things, and they don't want to know about anything, you know, post-1990 probably. So, you know, there are restrictions. So, you know, you can't have long, indulgent sequences that I would love to have. You know, you've got to keep the story moving, etc., etc., etc. So it is a very different entity. But in terms of access with Bowie, it was a very simple story that my first directing thing, I was given 10 two-minute shorts to make before Newsnight. And in the old days, they used to have a greengrocer or a butcher talking, or a normal person talking about a piece of art from an exhibition that was just about to start. And this was the 1990s, and they were already started on celebrity culture, so they said, oh, well, can you get some celebrities? You know, and they were two-minute things, and I thought, oh, who's going to do that? You know, who am I going to get? My boss said, write to your heroes, so I wrote to David Bowie. And, you know, it was the days before emails or anything like that, and he phoned me. I sent him a letter, and he phoned me. And he said, hello, Francis, I'd love to do this, you know. And from then onwards, he would phone me fairly regularly, and he kept in touch with me. I have no idea why. You know. So it was a relationship. That first film, was a relationship built up, from, you know, my childhood. I was an enormous childhood fan. And although we never talked about music, I know he knew that. And then it was a relationship built up over 20 years, the 18 years before he died. So it was a slow burn, I can tell you. But by that time, he trusted me enough to say, I won't be in it, but I will sort of help you from behind the scenes. And that was why we got the archive, that's why we got everyone involved. But even the archive, it's very, very difficult, because if you go as a producer and say, can I have that archive from, you know, Norwegian television from 1977, they'll say, absolutely you can. But you'll have to check with David Bowie's management. And so David Bowie's manager could at that point said, no, you can't. But they didn't. And in that way, we were very lucky. But it is a relationship built up over many, many, many years.
But there was a reason for really needing that archive, because it's not uncommon for artists not to want to be interviewed on camera. And it's a sort of device, if you like. Davis Guggenheim used it for the U2 film Achtung Baby, to first interview them off camera. It was also used with Crossfire Hurricane to interview them off camera. And it made quite a difference to the quality of what was said, actually. I would feel the same, because I hate being filmed. As I'm being filmed, I hate it. But I think with the Bowie, because he didn't want to talk, a lot of musicians don't want to talk about their lives and look back. What was amazing about that film was how you got him to speak from the archive. So you felt he was speaking, and you felt he was in the film, but actually it was from the past. We had an enormous team, and we had an enormous team of work experience people who were absolutely amazing and listened to hours and hours. And he had done a lot of interviews over the years, so he had spoken about most things. So it was just a question of just editing those interviews from the past and making it appear as though he was talking sort of in the present, although people knew he wasn't. But taking us through that story, you know. But that archive work, and you have the same, didn't you, with your film? I mean, finding the archive is incredibly important, isn't it?
And really fun too, yeah.
Yeah, really
fun. And then transcribing, you know, that was a huge part of our creative process, was transcribing decades worth of interview material so that you can find it.
And that's the first thing you do, is find that material, and then the story comes out of that.
And but it continues out throughout your whole process, you know. And we you know, didn't have Jerry Garcia, so we did master interviews with the remaining guys. But when we first started playing around with the edit, and we would just go to an archive for him, it was very disconcerting because he's jumping around in time. And you didn't actually get a feeling for the guy, because it just felt like, oh, we're an archive. So we just decided to choose one master interview, and then we actually used more than one, but we put that as voiceover. And we just called, you know, sound sweetened it so it looks like it's the other one. So we really do bounce around in time, but whenever you do see him, it's just the one interview basically, which we found in typical Deadhead fashion, somebody, we found a guy in India who had said, "Oh yeah, I have that. I videotaped that interview you're looking for. It's in a storage locker, but if you could help me out getting it out of there." So we had to like pay a guy, and then the tape didn't work. And then so we had to, because it had been sitting in a storage locker for 25 years.
Oh my God.
And then we rescued it, and it's this great piece of archive that nobody's ever seen.
It's amazing. Well, let's take a look at a clip from the film. So VT5, please. Fantastic.
One of the things we did there also, which I highly recommend, is we went to photographers, and you know, we said we don't want to pay by the photograph. We just want to buy out your whole lot. And it actually works out really well for everybody because, you know, you want the iconic photograph, but if you want to do fun kind of animation stuff, you want the 3 that were taken a second before it and the 2 that were taken afterwards. And if you just say like, you know, I can't afford to pay you for every instance of how one normally pays for photos, but I'll just pay you, you know, here's $10,000, give us everything you ever did and all your contact sheets and stuff. We did a ton of stuff, you don't see it here, but with contact sheets. And it just opens up the whole thing on a level that is really fun. And then, of course, there's a huge organizational job in terms of making sure you can find where all those photos are once you have them. But we had 15,000 stills in our database.
15,000?
Yeah.
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah.
It's amazing. I wanted to ask you about why Amazon. I mean, as a filmmaker, did you think, oh, I'm going to make this for Amazon for a reason,
no.
or was that? How did you come to that?
Paying all those photographers $10,000 each. We had a really big budget in the end, and you know, it ended up being 4 hours, which was not what it was supposed to be. It was meant to be 90 minutes. We had a contract that said 90 minutes, but we just kept going, and it took much longer than we thought. And in the end, they were the only people who could make my financier whole, more or less. But also, we liked them a lot. They're fans of the band, and they're really smart. They're doing interesting things over there, so like Ted Hope and Bob Burney and people that, you know, we have a great track record, and then these younger guys who are rock and roll fans and who shared my excitement about like. Sometimes, you know, the thing about with classic rock, basically, is that, you know, it's gotten so sort of incorporated into mainstream life that it's been kind of neutered, and so people think it's not dangerous anymore. And basically, it usually isn't dangerous. But I felt that the Grateful Dead had some pretty subversive ideas at the heart of it, but you wouldn't know that by their kind of cultural mythology. So it got the notion of Amazon putting it in 220 countries. Like overnight, made the radical in me very excited. So that was one thing that really got me going. Is like everybody thinks it's Captain Trips and it's harmless and it's Amazon, but it's like teenagers everywhere are going to be corrupted by this movie, and I like that idea.
That's great. But I suppose also, you know, obviously if you make a cinema film, it can be the duration it needs to be, more or less. But on television, of course, you've got to fit, you know, the slot, the, you know, 60 here and the 90, and the Channel 4's 49 minutes, whatever it is, and then all the commercial breaks and stuff like that. So you're kind of restricted into making that work, and then you distribute it around the world and it gets chopped into tiny pieces because all the TV broadcasters have different durations for their slots and stuff, which is Peter's job, because then he takes it somewhere and chops it all up, don't you? So
we try and avoid chopping it up, and I think it gets harder and harder to have different durations and versions. I mean, often you have maybe a 90-minute and a 60, but I try and fight to keep one duration. I would also say there is a hybrid model with broadcaster and digital platform. So the other film we're showing here, which I encourage you to go and see, is that boy child of Sheffield, Joe Cocker, Mad Dog with Soul, John Edgington's really good film. And again, with him, it was a question of, although Joe's sadly not with us anymore, getting the confidence of his widow and his brother over a long time to get them to talk about very sensitive issues. But quickly on the funding of that was actually, we had Sky Arts came in as a co-producer, and we put in they came in for probably around a third of the budget. And then we brought, subsequently, as the film was moving ahead and was completed, we brought in the rest of the funding from ZDF, Arte, Dutch television, and finally Netflix. But one difficulty I think you do have as filmmakers increasingly is those platforms like Netflix and Amazon, they want to see something. And they don't want just to see 5 minutes, they want to see a good chunk of the film. And maybe we can do that, but I think it's getting harder for independent producers because there's less of a culture of commissioning editors who get to know the work of the filmmakers and the directors and understand if you say, well, this is a film by such and such a director, they have that culture and are prepared to go in and take a risk within a channel. And if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out, but the channel's still there and they've got the license fee or whatever they paid for it. And I think it is an issue that the Netflixes and the Amazons and other digital platforms don't tend to have those resources, or they're very focused on a small number of
broadcasters are exactly the same internationally. They're all completely risk averse. It's not, I mean, that might well be true of Amazon and Netflix, but it's true of all broadcasters. Risk averse, everybody, basically, with all very, very, very few exceptions.
Or they want brand name directors, so you get less and less directors who have a brand name that can be associated, or you put a Martin Scorsese who doesn't even watch, dare I say it, probably doesn't watch the film, takes his exec producer fee, in order to give you, and I know, we tried to put together packages, and if an unknown filmmaker comes, you need something to help give a hook, to help explain to the broadcaster what to give some marketing tool more than a creative tool, in fact.
Absolutely. We did it with the second Bowie film at the beginning, if anyone's seen it the last 5 years, in some ways to sell it, and it's been bought by HBO, in some ways to sell it, we put the reality tour, so the last time he performed live and when he was well and when, he did an amazing set and he was looking fantastic. The first 10 minutes of the film is that, because that is what sold it to HBO. And we gave them that, even though the rest of the film had almost no archive because there wasn't anything filmed and it just had videos, etc. And we were, we had to find other ways of making that work. But the first 10 minutes is what did it. And without that, I think we would have struggled.
Well, I think editorially that was an interesting discussion because the question was to do the last 5 years, which were, a particular time for him when he obviously was not well at all, but doing some of his most extraordinary work. And it was interesting, I think, from the commissioning point of view. So I remember saying to Francis, but the audience coming to this, because it's the film on the anniversary of his death, will want to hear some of the hit songs. And fortunately, in the archive, David said, everything I've done is because of what's come before. And that gave us the idea to say, okay, well, we'll give you the past, we'll go forward with the past in it and relate his last 5 years to the great hits. So you could actually hear all those hits, which you wanted to hear emotionally on his anniversary. You wanted to hear those hits while you saw the story. You could have experienced the story that you hadn't seen.
I don't want to big up Jan here, certainly not, but it was a good creative relationship between me and Jan that I was able to say to her, okay, well, we've got the last 5 years, I really do want to do that film because I've done 5 years and we've sort of done a lot of this material. But to find a solution to that was to actually go back and say, okay, well, if he's talking about fame in a song on one of the last 2 albums, let's look back at how he dealt with fame through his career. So it was, but it was a creative relationship within the BBC to allow us to do that, and I was very lucky. And that's what I say. There is a certain amount of luck of who you're working with, and those people who will take a risk. But it's also, on the new project on the Sideman, I struggled with that because even now, trying to get it sold abroad, everyone says, "Well, what are Sidemen? We don't know how to sell that." The fact that it's got Mick Jagger and Billy Joel and Keith Richards in, they kind of want that to be the title. And you kind of go, well, that's not really what it's about. They're in it, but that's not what it's about. But the BBC are able to take those risks in a way that perhaps other people aren't because they can't immediately see a market for it.
Are these other platforms like Netflix and Amazon, are they risk averse? Do you think everyone's risk averse? Or is it, obviously BBC's a public service broadcaster and we're terrified we're going to offend somebody. And I mean, quite rightly, and language and drugs and all that stuff.
You just had me take motherfucker out.
Yes, they took the motherfucker out of the film. Yeah. Sorry.
I mean, my point wasn't whether they're risk averse. It was that they like to see something, and that's expensive for filmmakers.
Yeah.
You've got to commit yourself to the film rather than accepting a treatment, with a director.
In independent film, those days are long. I mean, you can't get away with a piece of paper with anyone. I mean, it's been like that for over a decade.
You need a taster and a trailer.
Independent filmmakers, the most impoverished, are expect they have to come with a minimum of not just a trailer, but then be prepared to give more.
Yeah,
so the onus is on the resource-poor creatives to deliver proof of concept. And when it comes to dealing with platforms or broadcasters, they're all the same. They want to see as much as possible and delay as much as possible, make you do as much of the work as far as possible before they go, okay.
Yeah,
and that's just the way it goes.
Yeah, chip in.
I just want to chip in and say that it's really important that Beadie's saying that. I've worked for 2 years on my film for no money. And I can't afford to do that. And we can't finish it. Has anyone got any money? It's unfortunately called Greatest Motherfucker.
Oh, is it?
So you're not going to want it.
It's a very easy
Dan will not have it on the channel.
Yeah.
So
I'll change the title if you've got 80 grand.
Yeah.
So my phone just beeped, and John is looking at me. His eyes are going because it's sort of question time. Oh. But I'd love to go on talking to you. It's so interesting, this discussion. But I just wanted to ask anyone in the room if they're an expert on music rights and if they wanted to stand and explain them to us, or whether it would help you if I tell you what I think is going on at the moment. Everyone's gone very silent. I thought if we had a panel about music rights, no one would turn up. Well, basically, and I just get this right, otherwise I shall never get up from Peter. There's been a sort of massive change, and it's actually partly to do with the BBC, really, because the BBC had very, very, very big hit shows like Top Gear and stuff, and going around the States, and they all had music in them. We had this thing called the blanket agreement, and then obviously selling your song in North America is you can earn quite a lot of money for that, 100,000 for a film or 20 grand a clip or whatever. And so I think there was suddenly a thought that maybe the sort of standard rate was not really fair, and because this music is worth much more than that. And I think because things got a bit out of hand, and so then a film went out, so I won't say which one because it was a very bad film went out, and it hadn't cleared the rights, and it caused a lawsuit. And then everyone said, well, hang on a minute, it's not quite right that the BBC can operate like this. So now the BBC does not have a blanket agreement for North America. The blanket agreement works in the UK, which means that you can make your film and have the music in your film, and there's no cost to the producer to have the music there. But if you suddenly want to make a film about Prince, and as everybody does right now, you can't just go and do that without the permission of the publisher. So, and then the other problem is, of course, if you've got a multi-artist film that has North American published music in it, then there's a thing called favoured nation. So it means that if you have a clip from, say, and I'm just making this up, Beyonce, and she wants £20,000, then everybody else in that film is entitled to get the same price. So you can't just negotiate it all at a different level. Anyway, the BBC is working very hard on this to sort this out from the BBC's perspective. And I just wanted Peter to say a few words about it, because Eagle Rock, of course, have their own blanket agreement, and it's a slightly different situation, I think.
We sort of have a blanket agreement. It is getting much more complicated. And historically, we've always had to clear tracks individually with individual publishers across the US, which means, for example, if you start making films about country music, and country music tends to have 4 or 5 different writers to an individual song, and you've got, say, 20 songs in your film, that means you've got to go to 85, and they're often little mom and pop publishers in Nashville or in Memphis, and they're not one of the big 4 publishers, and you have to go and negotiate with every single one. And if you fail to clear one of those tracks, that's a copyright infringement, and under US law that's $150,000 fine. So you're very exposed, particularly in the US, but increasingly also internationally. You have to clear, obviously, the master with the label, and that may be different labels in different territories. It's rare that the master's controlled by the same label worldwide. You will find that if you're doing one of those story ofs covering a range of time, that the masters will be owned by different labels because the artists move from label to label. You've also got to clear and normally your archive house, if they're providing you a live music archive, will probably tell you that they're not clearing the music with that, and you still have to go to the label to get the clearance. The label will then go back to the management of the artist and say, are you happy for us to license this piece of music? And so if it's not a film that they're approving or happy with, they will probably block it. Then you then have to clear the publishing sync, and even within there are those four separate copyrights in every piece of music. With the master, you've then got the sync, which is when the music is attached to an image, and you have the performance. And in many cases, a broadcaster will have an agreement to cover the performance part of the composition, but not the synchronization element.
Oh, you're all still with him.
See?
I'm just about drifting.
It's so funny.
Oh.
It's just this is what it's. I guess I'm the only American up here. All this, like, I didn't know there was anything but this.
Yeah.
It's like you guys talking about.
No, we've had a nice time. But I can tell you that one thing I want to say is incredibly important is that there's fair dealing and there's all that, but you know, with something like the Beatles archive, this is like the crown jewels, you know, Prince's archive, Bowie's archive. And if you could just take it and use it, it would be totally spoiled. And we have we work very hard to have a good relationship with the artists because, you know, it's their stuff. And I think when you work with a broadcaster, you can always come and say, look, you know, I want to make my Prince film. And then obviously we're in it together, and the approach is done together. And I know Peter has expert people working with him. So, but I think that one always has to balance out the passion for making your film with the respect for the artist whose work this is. And, you know, the last thing you want to do is break your relationship with one artist. Because, in fact, the reason why the BBC got in this mess was because somebody broke a relationship with a very important artist, and that triggered the whole thing to happen. So, you know, which has made a lot of trouble.
We're very briefly, we're in the middle of completing a film with a legacy artist who I won't mention, but unfortunately he hums two bars of a Stevie Wonder track and then tells a very funny story around this. It just comes out of his brain like that. And we're now in this heavy negotiation with the Stevie Wonder estate as to whether or not we can use this little piece of humming music, and if so, A, whether we can use it at all, and B, if we can, how much we'll have to pay to be able to use this 2 bars of humming. So, you know, it's things you can easily miss. You have to be really careful, and I think sometimes young researchers who, you know, YouTube is so ubiquitous for research nowadays. You need to be really careful that you're not thinking you can just put a YouTube clip into your film and that you can get away with it.
There's hope. Wait, no, there is always hope from indie land, which is that you're damn right. You know, if you're classic, the typical independent film, I'll be really lucky if I can afford one signature track on my film, and I'm probably going to save that, you know, for my final, you know, the final act. And actually, some of the most creative ways that many of the filmmakers we work with have got around it is by working with composers and creating an original soundtrack, which is beautiful and integral and totally affordable to the film. And I want to make a really big shout for that, because as well as lining the pockets of these wonderful established artists, we should also be supporting and working with amazing musicians now.
Agreed.
And there are incredible ways to do it. Incredible ways. I'm going to give you one tiny example, beautiful, because Jan will really appreciate this. One of my favourite Italian directors, this devilishly handsome man called Carlo Zarati, and he made a film called Special Need. And it was about his film, about one of his best friends, Enea, who is quite profoundly autistic, was desperate to get laid. And in Italy, where Enea lives, it's illegal for him to have sex. Because the state takes a view on his mental capacity and ability to do that. So Carlo decides to take him on a road trip around Europe to see if he can find love. This is the conceit for the film. And they were skint, obvs. And so they composed a soundtrack, an entire soundtrack for the whole film. They pre-recorded it. They then took that soundtrack as a CD, and that's the only thing that was allowed to play in the van while they toured around Europe. I can't tell you what a seamless seamless, brilliant device it was, and it cost them about 10 grand, and the whole
And you're
thing
showing
was
this
beautiful.
film, aren't you?
No, this is an older film, but look it up. It's
Yeah.
gorgeous. It's called The Special Need, and it will make you laugh and cry, and the music is wonderful. And it was a kind of cheap and cheerful and beautifully integrated creative solution.
That's brilliant, thank you. It's a positive note. Thank you. So, Amir, when is your film tomorrow? You can't remember the time,
I can't
can you?
remember.
Crap, I don't know the time. But
you know what, I'll say this.
do see it.
I mean, it's 4 hours long, and there's so many good films to see here. And I've been getting into the habit of saying, there's an intermission. Come for the first half of it, and if you want to leave, I will not be insulted.
He's going to be
You can go
counting
and
people
you
going
can
in
catch
and
the
out.
rest on Amazon or whatever. But one thing we did was we smuggled out of their vault the stems of their music. So we had all the individual multi-tracks, and we created a 7.1 surround sound immersive thing. So like if you see it in the theater, even if you see just an hour of it in the theater, you'll get an experience that nobody else is having, and I'm really excited by that.
Yeah.
Our sound team, like, it was a dream for them, and they basically created this three-dimensional sound.
Sounds amazing.
Experience. So,
Well,
yeah,
thank you so
thanks.
much. We just have a little bit of time for questions. So, any questions from anyone? There's one here.
Do I need a micro?
Oh, it's coming. It's coming.
Thank you very much for the extremely interesting discussion. I have a question for Peter, please, because of the rights. Because I'm producing a film called Soul Kids. It's about young people who are doing a revival tour through Europe. And so these songs, obviously, they will sing the old songs, Soul Men, Soul Fingers, all these known songs, but they will perform them. So we have to clear the publishing rights.
You have to clear the publishing, but not the masters, unless there won't be re-record restrictions. I wouldn't have thought with those songs, but no, you just have to clear the publishing.
That will be probably easier than
And hopefully, some broadcasters still have blanket agreements. It also depends on which tracks they are. Luckily, as Jan said, we have someone who is really specialised in this, and who will know. If you mention virtually any composition to her, she'll say, "Oh my God, it's Chuck Berry! Don't go near it!" Or yes, that publisher's really nice, and you can call them up, and that's perfectly straightforward. But
Take advice. This is the thing. Take advice.
But then still, if I want to put an old version, then
you have to get the master clearance.
And what about reversioning? Because we have a US co-producer, and they were talking about the possibility to reversion.
You can re-record it, so you would own the master, but you would still have the question on the composition will still belong to the publisher.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good.
Okay,
thank you.
Any others? One here, one over here.
Hello, I'm doing a documentary about polystyrene from X-ray specs, and there's a scene that we're going to set on Hastings Pier, where you have a tracking shot down the pier and her daughter's narrating, essentially to create a dialogue with her mum from the present to the past. And I want to sample Pretty Vacant, just the opening bars, maybe 4 seconds. Do I need permission for that, or can I do that as a sample and fair usage along those lines?
Well, I suppose it depends where it's being broadcast, really. If it's in the UK, if it's broadcast in the UK, it would be under the agreement. But if it's connected to a bit of film footage or something, you decided to fair deal it. But that's not something we would normally recommend. And if it's going to go internationally, you would have to clear it.
I mean, it would just be the audio, so just just that. But
I don't know.
I'm always told fair dealing doesn't exist.
Yeah, it doesn't really exist. It's funny, there's fair use in the States and there's fair dealing in the UK, but it doesn't really exist.
It wouldn't be fair dealing anyway.
It wouldn't be fair dealing, no.
There's fair dealing by quotation. If you just use very substantial amount.
But if it's in the space, if it's
in the space, it's a different matter. Yeah. So it wouldn't qualify, no. I mean, fair dealing is only when it's really criticism and review of the piece. So it's not just, you can have it. It's when you discuss the piece of music. Yeah.
I mean, if we get Celeste to say, you saw the Pistols, obviously a bit more elegant way of putting it, still no.
No.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No chance.
Anyone else? No, one over here.
Crowdfunding was just touched on a little bit by Pledge Music. I was just wondering, has anyone got any experience in the panel or advice to first-time filmmakers, second-time, who use it as a platform to get through to just in terms of are there things that should be watched out for if you want to get it to a certain platform, what you should or shouldn't do?
Maybe other filmmakers have specific advice. I know we've used it successfully, as I said, but principally to package. We haven't used it for raising money to make a film. We've principally used it to offer different versions and additional merchandising around films and using the targeting to the specific fan base. But I know, for example, the Zappa estate raised over $1 million to digitize and restore their entire archive. And in return, promised when we make a film of the story of Frank Zappa, you will get the DVD or you will get a place to the premiere or whatever, according to the level of funding that came in. I've heard quite a lot of people having, really finding it very successful fundraising, but I don't know, have you had experience, Beadie?
I mean, it's pretty standard now for independent filmmakers to either try some crowdfunding, either during the production phase, but also during distribution and outreach. And some of them do raise quite a lot of money, like a real amount of money. But it's really hard work, and you really need to know what you're doing, and you need to get a lot of advice and have an enormous amount of human capacity and digital know-how. That's like the answer to that question is a whole new panel in and of itself. Is there anyone at the festival from Kickstarter, though? You should go and find them. I wonder if there is. Or Indiegogo. Go and have a chat.
Indiegogo.
Like here.
Time for one more. I have a question to put to the panel.
Oh, yeah. Well, mate, you've already done it. Why are you asking? You're good. You're sorted. You're brilliant.
Well, I'm just curious if anyone has any advice to about, the intricacies of it in terms of what you've made.
I think you need to give us the advice.
No, you're the master. 72 grand. You're definitely the master. Brilliant.
So, Amir has a question for the panel.
I just had a question that maybe is useful for everybody. Has anybody up here really pre-cleared the music before they got deep into the film? Had it completely locked in. There's no, even if the film, if the film is abhorrent to the artist, it's too late. You signed it.
Yeah. Did you? Well, I think it depends. The thing is, you can't really clear it, and it's a bit like film clips. You can't clear it till you know how much you're using, in a sense.
Couldn't you make some kind of an agreement
that says... you do make those approaches up front, especially if it's a single artist film, because without the music you can't make the film.
Yeah, so on the second David Bowie film, David Bowie's family and management gave me sort of carte blanche to use any of his music, but that was a fairly exceptional circumstance. Whereas the current film has got so many different artists that, yeah, it's a very, very different and difficult proposition.
Yes, we're working on a film at the moment, and there were very complicated negotiations with the estate, and what we're trying to say is, okay, we can let you view a cut and you have approval over. You will be able to make comments on the factual accuracy of the film, but not on the editorial approach. And in return for that, you will give us access to your entire library. And in that case, it's owned by the label, which happens to be us, which helps, and the music publishing is also all in one place and controlled by the family.
We had a thing with our Sergeant Pepper film. There was another Sergeant Pepper film, and I saw this coming through. I thought, oh my God! But actually, it was a tribute band Sergeant Pepper film, and Apple said that was okay because it wasn't the real music. So that was okay, which I thought was interesting that they said that. But it was the editorial of the film was not to use the original music, and they were asked, and they said we're fine for you to do that.
I'm surprised
I know they allowed
the
it.
theatrical sync through from the.
But they
because you have to buy you have to, even if Jan can put the music under a blanket for television rights, you never can for theatrical. Theatrical rights, you would always have to go. So even if you're having this only a one-night-only event cinema release, you always have to go and clear all the music directly with a publisher. There are no collecting societies that handle theatrical clearances. So that's a whole different issue. And you can trim it a bit, saying if it's a festival showing, then it's non-theatrical, you don't need to clear the theatrical sinks. But for example, the Joe Cocker film, we would have loved to have had a commercial theatrical release, because it's a film which really speaks to a much wider audience. But because he only ever performed covers, there was no way we'd have been able to afford to clear those theatrical sinks.
Okay, well, that's it. I think we have to wrap up. Thank you very much to our wonderful panel.